everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and this is a show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. Today, instead of focusing on an event or a specific period, I propose to concentrate on an influential group of people in general, one that would be present on the North American continent from early on in its European development, and that would shape the future of many institutions in Canada, from schools to commerce to social justice, as well as, of course, language and culture. This is a group that formed a distinct and proud nation before coming to Canada, and that maintained many of the aspects of that culture once they settled, while still adapting it to a Canadian reality, becoming an early example of what would later be a part of the so-called Canadian mosaic. I'm burying the lead here as if you didn't already read the title, but today we're covering the influence and continued impact of the Scottish people in Canada. This is going to be the first of two parts, not because a single episode would be too long in itself. In fact, these might be shorter than usual, we'll see, but just because it would be less confusing to do two distinct episodes, as there are a lot of influences and impacts to cover, even if it's not always in depth. This episode is going to be admittedly more focused on the history of early Scottish immigration, with the cultural side being more general and less literary. I also want to talk about the Scottish people's role in Canadian commerce, and how their culture survived here in general. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that I set up a recommended reading page for you guys in case you wanted to dig in deeper and want to know more about the subjects that I cover on the show, both past and current. The link for that, as well as ways to get into contact with me, are in the description, so you can check that out if you want to. Without further ado, everyone, grab your haggis and bagpipes, and let's do this. I'm so sorry for that joke. Actually, you know what? No, I'm not. That was comedy gold right there. Anyway, on with the show. I guess it would be well to start a discussion about the Scottish in Canada with a clarification of sorts. There wasn't just one mass immigration of the group to the Great White North. All things considered, there are estimated to be about 5 notable waves of Scots that sailed across the sea at various points in time. These are pre-1815, from 1816 to 1870, 1871 to 1918, and 1919 to 1945, and finally 1946 to today. Because we haven't reached that historical point in the chronology of the show yet, and because there is only so much that I can fit in one episode at a time, the focus for now will be on the first 2 waves, those that are arguably the most important in terms of size, impact on demography, and Canadian culture in general. Another bit of context that can help listeners that are not necessarily familiar with Scotland and its history or culture is the distinction within Scotland's population and its relation to England. Within Scotland, there are multiple regions, but the most important and oft-referenced are the Highlands and Lowlands. There are alterations within these 2 divisions, but generally speaking, the Highlands are the harder to cultivate northern regions, dominated by a traditionally Gaelic-speaking population whose social interactions were dictated by clan membership, although both those aspects have slowly faded away with time. The Lowlands, by contrast, are the more agriculturally productive regions that are adjacent to England and, as such, are more anglicized than the Highlands, speaking a dialect of English known as Scots, and being more economically and socially similar to England. The interpretations of differences between the Highlands and Lowlands have varied, but we won't dwell on them here too much because they are not the focus of the show. I mention them because it will help listeners create an idea of who I'm referring to when I speak of where certain Scottish migrants come from. Alright, so the first wave of immigration, that is the one from before 1815, was mostly contained to the people of the Highlands. There are multiple reasons for this, but for the sake of brevity, The most important thing to remember is that the Highlands were different. They still spoke Gaelic, many of them were Catholic or another form of Protestantism known as Presbyterianism, and that irked the English power that would keep trying to exert control over Scotland, even after they succeeded in merging into Great Britain in 1707. Especially after that, actually. As such, many Scottish people from the Highlands were actually either forced out to go into the colonies or left willingly because of the pressures at home. But for a brief moment before that, Scotland managed to get in on the colonialism game independently from England, under the approval of King James VI, or James I if you were in England. That was a whole thing concerning two thrones and a crisis in succession, and then religion got involved. You know what? It doesn't matter here. The point is that the king allowed for the colony of New Scotland to be established in 1622 by Sir William Alexander. What does that sound like in Latin? Well, if you guessed the obvious choice of Nova Scotia, well, you'd be right. The charter granted to Sir William roughly covered the modern area of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, although it only held the name of the former. Each of these future provinces would have administrative names, namely Caledonia and Alexandria, for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick respectively. We've talked a bit about this brief period back in episode 4, but much like early New France, there was quite an issue with getting people to go to Nova Scotia. You see, one of the best ways to get people to move is through war as soldiers or troubles as hopeful settlers, neither of which plagued Scotland that hard in the 1620s. It would certainly be something that would very soon affect them in the grand scheme of things, but for now, Scotland was relatively all right. After a few conflicts concerning the ownership of the territory with the French, who would have known the land as Acadia, the Nova Scotia colony under Scottish rule would fail relatively early and would go essentially unused until the British conquest of the 1750s and 60s. What few Scottish immigrants there were would either return home or be absorbed by the French at that point. By the time of the conquest, which was over a century after the initial Nova Scotia failure, a few things had changed. Great Britain had been created by the merger of England and Scotland, and the Highlands had started to be cleared of people that were not considered to be quote-unquote English enough. In essence, the problems in Scotland were beginning to manifest in more ways than one. If you have ever heard of the Highland clearances, that is what they are talking about. The displacement of the Gaelic population by the English power in order to make room for better and more efficient exploitation of the land, and the replacement of people that would better assimilate into English customs. This was done by sending settlers within the very limits of the British territory, dissolving the clan system of the Highlands, and altering the management of the land so that few Scottish people actually owned what they used to in the Highlands. But despite there being some prejudices towards the non-English speaking Scots, there was also the perception that they were very hard workers, and that they would be the ideal people to send out to the growing colonies of the British Empire. And the logic for that was not entirely unfounded. Scotland was not an easy place to live in, even before the troubles that were caused by increased conflict with the English, both militarily and culturally. The Scottish were used to a life that required a lot of work in order to get by, both because of historical fights between clans, the holding on of that clan system that was dying out, as well as because of geographical and climate reasons. All of that mixed together made it that they were able to take it on the chin when going abroad to build up new places. For Canada, that meant that mostly in the Maritimes, but also in Upper and Lower Canada, about 15,000 Scottish immigrants would arrive throughout the first half of the 18th century in that first wave. By the end of the first period of Scottish migration to Canada, there were even some that were being settled in what would become Manitoba, in the Red River colony established by Lord Selkirk, who would also send many Scots to land he owned in Prince Edward Island. Many of these migrants were lured to Canada like so many immigrants to this massive territory over the years, by the promise or desire for better or greater sizes of land to live on. With that land, many people saw the possibility for greater freedom and opportunities that wouldn't necessarily be available to them back home. With what I mentioned earlier about the clearances, it is not surprising that the Scottish would see places like Canada within that light. The kicker was, though, that because nothing in this world is free, many of the settlers would receive land grants once they had served in the army. As the first Scots arrived, they were put to excellent use within the British Army during two important conflicts that we have touched upon multiple times in this show: the British conquest of Canada and the American Revolutionary War. Their dedication and work ethic, their willingness to fight to secure the British supremacy in North America, and, by extension, their freedom within it, can be seen in some of the writing about them from recollections of these conflicts. In fighting against them during the British conquest, an Acadian militiaman named Joseph Trahan wrote of the Fraser Highlanders, who are not to be confused with the men who traveled with another Scott explorer named Simon Fraser, after whom the Fraser River is named. But Trahan wrote that, quote, "I can remember the Scotch Highlanders flying after us with streaming plaids, bonnets, and large swords, like so many infuriated demons, over the brow of the hill." End quote. Okay, just quick aside here. If that doesn't sound like an absolute epic scene in a war movie, I don't know what more you guys want. This is some Braveheart levels of cool sounding moments. Just imagine how terrifying it would be to see a slew of tartan-clad sword-wielding soldiers run down a hill at you, and you can't even scream at them to stop because most of them only speak Gaelic and not French or English yet. Honestly, that sounds brutal. Anyway, as I said, this is pretty indicative of some of the things that would be held on to by the arriving Scottish populations in British North America, which would become Canada, and their descendants in Atlantic Canada. We've touched on the dedication and work ethic already, this sense of putting your all into an endeavor that was associated with the Scottish people. But we can definitely talk about the military as well. As Trahan noted, and as we recognize as a typically Scottish or Celtic object, the plaid kilt is an emblematic symbol of the Scottish heritage. While its genuine value and importance to Scottish culture has been debated by historians and scholars throughout the years, the kilt is nevertheless something that has been brought into the fold as specifically associated with Scotland. Throughout its history, it has been used in a variety of settings, but in Canada, it has remained for two major aspects of that heritage: traditional fun and games, such as folk festivals or regional Scottish-based sports tournaments, which we'll touch upon later, as well as the military. Now, there are no regiments in the Canadian Army that wear the kilt into battle, don't worry. But in ceremony and in name, Scottish symbolism has permeated into a few of them. It is very common to see bagpipes and kilts be played and worn during ceremonies that implicate the Canadian Army, from royal parades to funerals to inaugurations, you name it. In fact, there are 16 regiments of the Canadian Forces that have adopted the name and iconography of the Highland Scottish heritage. Many of them are based in Ontario and the Maritimes, but there are some across Canada as well, namely in Alberta with the Calgary Highlanders, and in British Columbia with the Canadian Scottish Regiment Prince Mary's. It may seem odd for some of my listeners that I focus this much on military history, but I think it's important to recognize that there is more to a culture and heritage than what we would typically expect it to be. That is, the arts, for example. The way people adopt and associate within the military is a great way to assess the impact of a people like the Scottish in Canada, in my opinion. A big part of culture is the way people assemble around things and live the shared experience. And the military and war experiences can be one of those ways. It shows a desire to remember the service of these communities to transform Canada into what it is today. That can be for good or ill, obviously, but it is an undeniable part of the heritage and culture nonetheless. I will still move on now to another, more recognizably cultural aspect of the Scottish Canadians. While they were few compared to the number of English or French-speaking populations that were growing in the colony, these Gaelic-speaking Scots were settled in relatively unpopulated areas and in places where they could stay within their own communities without having to assimilate within a larger Anglophone or Francophone culture. Many of the farming and trading establishments that were set up in the Maritimes or under the auspices of the Hudson's Bay Company would continue speaking Gaelic and practicing their religion. Even with the arrival of the Loyalists in the 1780s, the Scottish communities among them would do the same in Upper Canada, keeping strong fraternal bonds within larger Canadian or American communities. This would establish a kind of groundwork that would stay for quite some time throughout Eastern Canada, even as other populations arrived throughout the 19th century. I know it's typical of this show to use literature to examine the impact of a people or event, and we will get to that. But this is also a show about culture in general, and the Gaelic culture is one that has a noted impact on Canadian traditions and lifestyle, especially in the Atlantic provinces. This is a culture that probably would not have survived if it had stayed within small agricultural communities in the Maritimes. It would have died out by the mere fact that they would have been outnumbered eventually. What helped the Scottish get a strong foothold in early Canada was the movement of the people, their presence in important companies or institutions, as well as being among the early settlers who kind of broke ground in certain areas. After the natives, of course. As we'll see in the next part, they will also have their hands in building up many of the ideals that we have in Canada, and that helped especially also. What I want to do for now, though, is begin with the use of language and music, before continuing on more specifically into commerce. You might be tempted to think that many of these Scottish migrants brought music and song along with them to their new homes. I mean, it's a great way to pass the time after all. And you wouldn't be wrong to think so. But the influence of such songs has been limited in the grand scheme of Canada's expanse. And honestly, that is to be somewhat expected. With a country as large as this, and the variety of immigrants that come in and mix over time, it is hard to keep a consistent musical feel from one end of the country to the next. Even with, as we'll get to, the amount of Scots that traveled the breadth of the country over the centuries. The place where you will feel the most consistent presence of traditional Gaelic music, which includes the use of fiddle, lyrics in Gaelic or Scots English, and a ballad style of playing, is still in the isolated parts of the country, like Cape Breton in Nova Scotia and in Prince Edward Island. While it would have been present with settlers in other parts of the country, namely with transportable instruments like the fiddle, the lack of available information makes it difficult to assess the extent to which this was used or how prominent it was and how long it lasted. Now, many of these songs would have been very vocal-based, with little use of big sets of instruments, as they wouldn't have been widely available in Canada or been capable of easy transport either from Europe or within Canada, and the manufacturing process at the time, when the first Scottish settlers arrived in the 18th century, would have been very limited. In terms of themes, the songs would have been quite related to a Gaelic tradition as well, with many lyrics being centered around laments, epic tales, or, as you might expect from a settler colony, work. The use in song of the Gaelic language, as heard in Scotland, would have been restrained to the maritime provinces I mentioned, as the Scots English lyrics would have blended in with the other English tunes and ballads that popped up around the country in the early days of settlement. As such, you will still get a similar type of Scottish folk vibe in the areas that I've been talking about from the beginning, namely from the Maritimes to Ontario, but the language gap will disappear as you move westward from the Atlantic Ocean. It is worth noting that another reason why such a Gaelic vibe remained present was that the Irish would also bring a similar style to the country as they would arrive in droves, especially during the potato famine, much later on from where we're talking about now. We won't touch upon it just yet, but it is something to keep in mind as a factor that led to the continued prevalence of simple fiddle-based laments or ballads in Atlantic Canada. I wish I could play some of these tunes for you on the show, but potential copyright problems would make that complicated. If you want to compare, you can always look up older Scottish or Gaelic tunes like Glenloggie and compare it to more modern artists from Canada's Atlantic like Stan Rogers or Dick Nolan, or songs like Farewell to Nova Scotia. Interestingly, much the same can be said about language and its usage in poetry or common speech, as has just been said about songs. Gaelic was actually a major part of the Canadian language landscape for quite some time, but would disappear or diminish gradually for a number of factors that go beyond the overrunning of Highland Scottish communities by other non-Gaelic speakers. It's actually estimated that the Gaelic language was the third most spoken language in British North America by 1850, which is a bit out of the purview of our current period, but it shows its prominence nonetheless. Now, to be fair, British North America was very small at that point, at least compared to what Canada would become, and it essentially covered the Atlantic coast and the area immediately surrounding the St. Lawrence. So its population reflected that. But it's still quite a feat to have been accomplished by the Gaelic speakers. What has led to the decline of Gaelic's usage, even in Nova Scotia, was the diminished use of it in the Highlands themselves, and public education. By the 19th century, New Highland immigrants were speaking less and less of their traditional language and more English, namely for the reasons of domination by powerful Englishmen that I mentioned at the top of the episode. And so, gradually, despite the continued arrival of Scots, the language was diluted, if you will, into a sea of English, even among their own people. Also, the Scottish, who were a major part of the introduction of public education in British North America and Canada, as we'll see in Part 2, would not emphasize the use of Gaelic enough to warrant its teaching in institutions. So, over time, it would have been naturally diminished as its use became increasingly irrelevant within the Canadian context. Beyond existing within these communities, both music and poetry, and even games associated with Scotland, like the caber toss for example, would be perpetuated in Canada by the creation of festivals and societies that provided a forum for the expression of that culture. The so-called Caledonian Games and the Robert Burns Society are two of the better-known examples of this, although only the latter continues to exist. In its most consistent form, obviously, there are still Scottish games that are produced throughout the country. Attentive listeners will recognize that Caledonia was the administrative name given to the future province of Nova Scotia by Sir William Alexander, and festivals like the Caledonian Games, which began in the early 1800s until nearly the next century, wanted to create a continuity with that early Scottish presence in British North America. The Robert Burns Society, which celebrates Scotland's famous poet and his well-known use of the Scots-English dialect, is still minimally active in some parts of Canada today, including Montreal or Winnipeg. Such groups exist not because of any association that Burns himself had with the colonies or Canada, but because of a nostalgic vision that many descendants of Scottish migrants had of the old country. In perpetuating associations with purely Scottish symbols, more than adapting some of these to the reality of North America, like the games or the music, many of these societies just ended up creating further divides and closed off communities of Scots, rather than being Canadians with a Scottish heritage. This is something that has gotten criticism over the years from people who had perceived immigrants from Scotland as remaining nostalgic, or of perpetuating a form of gatekeeping, rather than creating the basis of new traditions in a new setting outside of Scotland. The same is actually sometimes said about the continued use of the kilt, that it is a cosmetic depiction of culture rather than a tradition that adapts over new contexts. But that debate is not for us to answer here. For the most part, many of these cultural properties did form a larger sense of Canadian identity over time, alongside other cultures that arrived from everywhere in the world. If we look at the Caledonian Games, where there were not only sports that were put on display like the hammer throw, or as I mentioned before, the caber toss, but folk music and all kinds of things. For a while, many people from across Canada came to see these games and to participate actively and really absorb the Scottish culture that was kind of evolving in British North America. It was considered actually one of the more popular events. And so you can see this mixing happening that really can be a testament to how Scottish people adapted to Canada. I want to end this first part with commercial endeavours that the people of Scotland were a part of. So we've talked here and there about the fur trade in Canada, namely in the early episodes about exploration. It's difficult to overstate just how important that industry was to the development of North America, and specifically Canada, with some historians like Harold Innis even claiming it to be the determining factor in the development of an economy and society here. The reason why I'm bringing it up again is that the Scottish were important in its development, with many of them being linchpins in the creation of companies and settlements that were vital to the fur trade and, by extension, the flourishing of populations. In cases like this, it's important to remember that it wasn't just the poor and destitute that came to Canada. While they did form an important part of the Scottish population, there were also some rich landlords that tried to make their way in Canada with new opportunities, and they already had a financial basis in the old country, if you will, and they came to even expand further in the new country with offers to the British Empire, as we will see with these multiple examples. Historian J.M. Bumstead actually has a whole book called The People's Clearance, which is a bit of a revisionist history on just how many poor people came to Canada during the Highland clearances, in that rich businessmen were actually a big part of this. Anyway, just a suggestion. Let's look specifically at two examples, the Northwest Company first, and then the Canada Company with Scottish writer John Galt. That's right, folks, we're actually going to have a literary pit stop today. Woohoo! Anyway, jokes aside. As we might recall from the Alexander Mackenzie episode, the Northwest Company was born out of Montreal in the 1780s through a desire to compete with the very powerful Hudson's Bay Company. It was created from the union of multiple smaller companies and rich shareholders. Chief among them were Simon McTavish and James McGill, two Scottish businessmen, the latter of which would provide the funds and name for the founding of the famous McGill University. Within the Northwest Company, former soldiers, many of them also Scottish in origin, would join in order to explore and settle in various parts of Canada, securing territories for trade and for exploitation by the British Crown through the company. The aforementioned Earl of Selkirk is one of the more famous Scottish examples of this, with his pushing of Scottish immigrants in Prince Edward Island and the Red River settlement in Manitoba. Like many others, he would send men to uncharted or unsettled lands and give a pied-à-terre, if you will, for the continuation of the trade from there. Selkirk, within the Northwest Company, is probably best remembered for the blunder of the initial Red River settlement that caused a straight-up battle between the men of the Hudson's Bay Company who wanted that land and the Northwestern men who were establishing themselves there. I won't go into too much detail about the so-called Battle of Seven Oaks here, but it goes to show the lengths that settlers and the Scottish were willing to go to in order to do what they saw as good business in British North America. The business would have had little impact economically speaking, or monetarily speaking, on Canada, as most of the money made by the Northwest Company ended up in Britain. But the exploration and community establishment that it set forth was not to be worthless, and would establish a set of events into motion that would lead to both good and bad moments, including the later Red River Rebellion led by the Métis, who were also working alongside the Scottish in the area at that same time. Remember, the Métis were a group of mixed people that were born out of relations that French explorers had with Native American women. And it's one of the reasons why Canadians and the British had a bit more facility getting west than the Americans, because they had that relation with the population that was already more established than, say, the Americans, who would be more apt to go to war with them instead. But that's neither here nor there. We'll get to that a bit later also. And let's face it, the relations with the Métis would also sour quite a bit. The Northwest Company would actually be one of the most successful business ventures of that time, and really put a damper on the profits that the Hudson Bay Company was making, taking in roughly 2/3 of the entire fur trade in Canada, which is in part why there was the Battle of Seven Oaks, right? Each of these were hiring soldiers, and they would actually fight themselves, not just in this battle, but many times over, because there was so much money to be made, and because they had access to these soldiers. So it was really worth it to actually push forward and say, okay, no, we're going to make it. And so it really goes to be a testament of, in part, Scottish and definitely other groups, of creating these successful business ventures that would have a lasting impact on how Canadians did business, or how business was conducted in British North America. Less for the war and battle aspect, and more in terms of the building up of companies that advance a form of community building while still being profitable. Again, for good or ill, it really depends on the moment or how you look at it. I'm not going to be the one to solve that question anytime soon. Eventually, the Northwest Company would actually be bought out by the Hudson's Bay, but for quite a while it was its own thing that has its worthy historical footnote in Canadian history. As an extension of this drive for settlement, we can touch upon the Canada Company, which will also get us onto John Galt, the only author we will really touch on today, and that will also get us to come full circle on the Scottish perception of work, as well as finally lead us into the second wave of Scottish immigration. Galt himself is from the second wave, having arrived from Ayrshire in the Lowlands in the mid-1820s, after more important Scottish immigrants like John A. Macdonald or William Lyon Mackenzie, for example. But I believe that he is more of an indication of the transition between one generation of Scots and another, between a generation that was focused on work to one that was interested in building a society, albeit with some bumps along the road. While always having an intermittent literary career, as well as being a well-received poet, Galt was also a businessman. The latter was in fact the main source of his income. In the 1820s, before even coming to British North America, Galt had proposed to establish a company that would buy Crown land and sell it to immigrants as a way of satisfying the need to find places to live for officers of the War of 1812 and claimants to the United Empire Loyalist advantages that were still coming in. In 1825, Galt therefore became the superintendent of the Canada Company, which was charged with settling the Huron Tract, a piece of land near the Great Lakes that would expand Upper Canada. For the few years that Galt would be in such a position, he would turn his literary attention to writing propaganda pieces that would incite people to settle, which, as we've seen in the past, namely in the Newfoundland episode, was not an uncommon thing to do with poetry and pamphlets at the time. Galt would actually be deposed from his position only a few years after he had begun in 1825, mostly due to his administrative incompetence. But his writing career would continue and would inform how we understand his approach to settlement, namely in his autobiography, but also in his fiction work, like Bogle Corbett. A passage of the autobiography indicates that his plans for places like Guelph, which he helped found, went something like this. Quote, I had, like the lawyers in establishing their fees, an eye to futurity in the magnitude of their parts. A beautiful central hill was reserved for the Catholics, in compliment to my friend Bishop Macdonald, for his advice in the formation of the company. The centre of a rising ground, destined to be hereafter a square, was appropriated in the Episcopal Church for Archdeacon Strachan, and another rising ground was reserved for the Presbyterian. End quote. There's another one not long after where he refers to education within Guelph. Quote, "In planting the town, I stipulated that the half of the price of the building sites should be appointed to endow a school, undertaking that the company in the first instance should sustain the expense of the building, and be gradually repaid by the sale of the town lots." End quote. Now, it is difficult to say how much of that is actually true and how much is revisionism after he had been canned and wanted to save face. Of course it was good. I was accepting Catholics and Episcopalian, and look at those schools that we would have built. It seems almost too good to be true, right? But considering what we know about the approach of other Scottish administrators and their mentality concerning the building of societies, especially from a Presbyterian perspective, which many Scottish people were, it would not have been a completely unreasonable idea for Galt to have. This is an idea that I'm opening here, but that again I'll develop later when I talk more specifically about education in part 2. His works of fiction, Bogle Corbett and Laurie Todd, are also seen as indicators of how Galt viewed the place of immigrants, in these cases Scottish ones specifically, and how they approach settlement differently in Canada and in the United States respectively. Elizabeth Waterston, Professor Emerita at the University of Guelph, wrote of these books that, quote, "Bogle Corbett and Laurie Todd are rightfully seen as pair, not so much because they deal with the same experience, immigration, at the same time, around 1825, and in roughly the same place, north and south of Lake Ontario, as because they discriminate carefully between group settlement and independent settlement. The Scot-turned-Canadian, Bogle Corbett, is more genteel, more inhibited and dour, and more rigid in opinions than is Laurie Todd, the revolutionary Scot turned successful American. Of the two books, Laurie Todd was more popular, partly because of its more varied description of bush and river, roads and settlement. But Bogle Corbett, with its unheroic protagonist, his shrewdish wife, inefficient co-workers, burdensome dependents, bad luck, and uninspiring setting, opens an important line of Canadian fiction, that of counter-romance, made palatable by the play of pocky humor and by subtlety and staunch honesty of reportage." End quote. So Galt made a distinction between these two ways of life, and used the Scot to get his message across as to how his people, and arguably how others coming to British North America, would join into settlements and what to expect in different areas. But in contrasting the ideas disseminated in his works of fiction and the non-fiction work, we can see a broad perspective that Galt and his contemporaries saw as the future of the colonies in British North America, a place where you will need to work hard, but that will lead to opportunities and a better and more equal life. As we also see through Galt, and especially through the comparison of Bogle Corbett and Laurie Todd, these were attempts at being more just, and also that placed development responsibility not just in the hands of the individual, as for example it would have been in Laurie Todd, but in the government and the community as a whole, as Bogle Corbett would have represented. So once again, we see this development of a more communal mentality rather than a more individualistic one as Canada would develop. Now, as we'll see as our history goes on, this dream of equality and social justice might not realize itself exactly as planned, with some groups having difficulty being a part of that dream, especially at first. Yet, as we will start to see in part 2 of our examination of the Scottish in Canada, it is an interesting step in the right direction, one that will set Canada apart in the way it builds and accepts communities into its fold. The Scottish might well be recognized for the obvious and easily identifiable things they brought to Canada. This is what we saw today: influences in music, language, games, and commercial endeavors. But as we saw with John Galt, and as we'll expand upon in the next episode, if it weren't for the Scottish, many of the systems we currently have in place today might not have developed in the same way or at all. We obviously cannot say that for certain, as history is always about how multiple factors interact with each other. But the Scottish are definitely an integral part of that equation in the Great White North. As a way to cap off this discussion, that lasted much longer than I had originally planned, by the way, I wanted to read you a part of a poem from 1828 called Canadian Boat Song that I think sums up much of what we discussed today, and, also allows you to get that literary fix that I kind of set aside for today. It is an anonymous poem, but many writers have been attributed to its composition, including the one we just spoke of now, John Galt. So here we go, here's just one stanza. From the lone Shieling and the misty island, mountains divide us and the waste of seas, yet still the blood is strong, and the heart is Highland, and we in dreams behold the Hebrides. Okay, that should be just about it for this episode. Thank you everyone for listening. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page, through Twitter, and by email. All links are in the description below. As always, you can support the show through the Ko-fi page and soon on Patreon, so stay tuned for that. I'm in the process of setting it up. You can also let me know what you would like to see out on the Patreon through any of those links that I just mentioned. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes or elsewhere, it would be very appreciated. It really does help to boost the show. For now, I'll just say that I wish you all excellent health, and that I hope you and your loved ones can stay safe in these intense times. I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.